All right, let's get started. Welcome. Thank you for joining us for this webinar. We expect it'll be about 45 minutes, though we're certainly open to taking a little bit longer if the questions get heated and interesting. My name is Richard Sulls. I'm a security and risk management consultant at WithSecure. With over 20 years experience, I enjoy threat modeling, tabletop and crisis management design and delivery, e-discovery, design review, and on the side, I'm an expert witness for the federal and state courts in the US. I've been likened to a Swiss Army knife of tech. And with me is my esteemed colleague, John Gerald. John, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm John Gerald. I'm a security and risk management at WithSecure. I have over 10 years experience working with financial institutions on developing cybersecurity programs and achieving regulatory compliance. And I was also involved in 2017 at a large bank doing an assessment and helping develop a remediation plan for the original version of the New York DFS cybersecurity regulation.
Thanks, John. Before we start, maybe you could give us a quick overview of our agenda.
Sure. So I think really two things we want to cover today is first just explaining, talking about the original cybersecurity amendment and sharing with you some analysis we've done on the enforcement actions that have resulted from that to give you an understanding of what types of challenges covered entities had faced. And then secondly, talk about the upcoming Second Amendment, what it means, and some ideas of how you might help prepare your organization for that.
Great, let's jump right into the overview and impact of the original regulation. And John, if you want to cover that.
Sure. Okay, so just an overview. I think everybody already is familiar with New York DFS, but NY DFS is a regulatory agency that's responsible for overseeing the financial institutions that are operating in New York. They're responsible for their charter is really ensuring the safety and soundness of financial institutions and protecting customers and promoting the growth of the New York financial services sector. In March of 2017, the New York DFS enacted the first cybersecurity regulation, which was officially called 23 NYCRR Part 500, so often referred to NY DFS 500. The intent of this regulation was to ensure that covered entities establish and maintain a strong cybersecurity program to protect consumers and the financial sector from what they're seeing as increasing pace and sophistication of attacks by cyber criminals that were targeting specifically the finance industry. The key parts of that regulation were first that covered entities needed to do a risk assessment, which would inform their cybersecurity mitigation activities, that they needed to designate a qualified CISO who was designated to implement the cybersecurity program, and then to implement cybersecurity functions such as identity and access management, vulnerability, third-party risk management, incident response. There were a number of different areas that needed to be covered. That regulation also required regulated entities to notify New York DFS within 72 hours of experiencing any cyber incident and to submit an annual certification of compliance with the regulation.
Thanks, John. So if an entity is non-compliant, then they typically would see enforcement actions, and I'm going to kind of give you a high-level overview of some of that right now. So enforcement actions are legal measures that DFS takes against covered entities that violate its regulations. Most of these actions are based on a consent order. It's a legally binding document. It outlines the terms and conditions agreed upon by DFS and the entity to settle the matter without going to trial. Typical consent orders describe the incident that led to the action. They identify specific sections of the regulation that were violated and prescribe remedial actions, which typically include a monetary penalty. Enforcement actions are public documents. They're published on the DFS website and are usually accompanied by a press release. In March of this year, 2023, at least 11 entities have been impacted by the enforcement actions of DFS, and they included monetary penalties for violating those regulations in each case. John reviewed these consent orders to gain a better understanding of the challenges faced by the impacted organization. And now, John, maybe you could give us a little more detail about the findings.
Sure, thank you, Richard. So Wish Secure had sponsored me on a project to do review these enforcement actions. So I had the pleasure of reading through all of them that had been enacted by March. So what we found is that of the 47 enforcement actions total that the New York DFS had issued since 2020, 11 of those, 23%, so almost a quarter of the enforcement actions since they enacted the cybersecurity regulation have been related to the cybersecurity regulation. The average monetary penalty for failure to comply was almost $3 million. The actions that we reviewed identified 55 separate violations of specific sections of the regulation. So these enforcement actions and the consent orders go into a lot of detail about what happened. Seven of these actions, 63%, included a violation for falsely or improperly certifying compliance with the regulation. So it's basically something that New York DFS will tack on to a consent order for any organization that experiences a cyber breach, that this means you didn't follow or were not in compliance with the regulation. We also saw that little over half of those consent orders specified specific or prescribed specific remedial action that needed to be taken. That also lately has also included a requirement to engage a third party to do verification of the remediation. So that's new and something that's being added. And then with regard to the security incidents, so these consent orders described 15 separate security incidents that occurred. I think nobody on the call will be surprised to learn that 13 of those were as a result of phishing attacks and failure to implement multi-factor authentication that would have prevented those credentials that were compromised in these attacks from being used to compromise an account. 8 of the security incidents resulted in exposure of non-public information. 3 of the incidents involved a ransomware attack, and 3 of the incidents also involved theft of funds, which was across all 3, the total was almost $2 million of stolen money.
That's incredible. That's very interesting. And quite frankly, those are just findings from the First Amendment, of course. As we can see, the cost of doing nothing is significantly higher than the cost of meeting the regulations, simply from the point of view of being attacked. Obviously, the Second Amendment is more rigorous. John, could you go into a little bit of a high-level understanding of the Second Amendment for us, please?
Sure. So in September 2022, the New York DFS published a proposed Second Amendment to the regulation. Their rationale for doing so was to address common weaknesses that they'd identified through enforcement actions since 2017. So specifically, some of the areas they mentioned were failure to properly implement MFA, and that was really tied to all of the incidents involving phishing attacks, that if multi-factor authentication had been in place, they may have prevented the attackers from using the compromised passwords. They also cited failure to remediate vulnerabilities in a timely manner, not replacing vulnerable end-of-life systems, not securing ports that allowed remote access, not providing sufficient monitoring of system activity to detect anomalous or malicious activity, and just overall they saw that the entities involved in these consent orders had not implemented policies and procedures to keep pace with the increasing, evolution of the threat landscape. At this point, New York DFS has not published or communicated a specific timeline for the enactment of the Second Amendment. As with the first regulation, they did open up a period for public comments where the regulated entities could provide feedback on the draft report. That window closed in January, and it's been radio silence from then until just about a couple weeks ago. At the end of June, DFS came back and with a assessment, they published an assessment of the comments and that they'd received and an updated version of an updated draft of the Second Amendment, which took into account the comments they received. And they also opened up a second period for public comments, which closes on August 14th. So we can expect, that this probably will be the last window and that the regulation may be enacted sometime in the early fall.
Thanks, John. And I think that those of us in the security field can appreciate this list. I know I've personally walked into a client's office where they were running a Novell server that had been up for years and not been touched. So, end-of-life systems are always a concern. I think that that's just touching the tip of the iceberg, honestly, but always a good anecdote. Thank you for that. So as I said, we've seen these problems firsthand at WithSecure and most of us otherwise, and have seen them with covered entities and non-covered entities. It's just a condition of our current state of cybersecurity. So there are key considerations for compliance, strategies for preparing and adapting to the evolving regulations, best practices for compliance and risk mitigation. And I'm going to talk about a few of the most impactful changes, the first being vulnerability remediation. And we could drill further into this, certainly put any questions that you have in the chat. But one part of vulnerability remediation is timely remediation. And we know that that can be resource intensive. It requires close collaboration with multiple teams frequently. It can be disruptive to workflow, and it makes it very difficult to do. But ultimately, again, ignoring it tends to cost more than the cost of actually fixing it. So the upfront cost of fixing it appears greater initially. John, did you want to add anything to vulnerability management or remediation before I move along?
Yeah, I think everyone on the meeting is familiar with the challenges with vulnerability management. False positives, needing to do manual reviews of systems that don't integrate with your scanner, the challenges of end-of-life systems that vendors don't provide security updates any longer. The challenges with just asset discovery, that these scanners don't always detect everything, and there could be subnets that you're not aware of or other environments that you're not aware of. All of those are challenges. So I think one suggestion here would be, especially if you've got a backlog of vulnerabilities to remediate, which a lot of organizations do have, this would be a time to press on that and say, let's see what we can do around closing out any backlog that we have in preparation for this becoming a new requirement, and then also just ensuring that you've got proactive patch management practices. So don't wait for Qualys to detect the vulnerability. Should be having your system managers proactively, acquiring and testing and applying patches.
All very great points. Thank you. And you mentioned assets. And that kind of brings me to our next point, which is asset inventory. This is something else that is an impactful change and has a lot of effects upon organizations. What we've often seen, John and you and I, while working together at WithSecure, is that systems aren't always well inventoried in organizations, and that some organizations may take on a new CISO or even a new chief of IT who's unaware, or the entire organization, those responsible, are unaware of the inventory or certain assets within the organization. It's a common problem, especially as organizations grow. And we've seen, both of us firsthand, that automated asset discovery can often fail, often requires manual intervention. and can be prone to error, quite frankly. Do you want to discuss some other asset inventory challenges that you've seen, John?
Sure. So I think everybody's aware that regardless of best efforts, that asset inventories are always going to have data quality issues. It's just inevitable with the amount of data that you're dealing with and the complexity of collecting and maintaining it, that there are going to be errors. So that's one. As more and more organizations are implementing and moving to cloud environments, that becomes complicated, given that you're dealing with ephemeral assets and you may have multiple accounts across multiple providers. So again, maintaining inventory in that type of environment becomes even more challenging. We're all, I think, aware of the challenges of shadow IT, so that you could have your business units implementing services or assets that you're not even aware of, which can come back to be another challenge. And then another piece that can be complicated is just integrating your asset inventory across your different security functions. So like, for example, vulnerability management, right? You would want your vulnerability management solution to be using your central asset inventory for scanning, but in a lot of times, in some cases, that may not be practical. So you end up with the VM solution, handling a different list of assets than are in your inventory. Same goes for security, incident event management. Systems should be using the central inventory. Incident response, so you'd want to have your inventory tightly integrated or supporting your incident response process, because this allows you to identify the assets, engage the owners if that's recorded, that you can help to classify the incident, the risk level of the incident based on the risk of the asset that's been effective. And you can also start to do your security operations team can do the analysis around what is the attack surface and what are potential for lateral movement of different systems that are integrated with the affected asset. So again,
you raise a great.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, I'd just say I think everyone is well aware of all the challenges and complexity around asset inventory, and adding that to the amendment is going to create additional room for error.
Of course, yeah, and you raise a great point actually with IR. As someone who's led occasional IR team responses, I've found that not every organization manages their asset inventory well, but when they do, they are able to provide their incident response third-party folks or folks who work with them in-house a greater degree of asset documentation, which then enables the IR folks to really chase down the cause of the incident, the threat actors. It really helps with the IR investigation in a large way. So these things, and not just that, obviously, not just asset inventory, but a lot of these things tie into each other in terms of having a robust and proactive security offering as an organization. The last, and there's, again, many other impactful changes, but another one that we want to talk about is privileged access management. And obviously, this is nothing new to those of you who are responsible for security with your organization. But some of the changes that this amendment is specifically speaking to include privileged activity monitoring, which is session monitoring and post-implementation reviews of those using privileged accounts. And John, maybe again, I just want to see if there's anything about privileged access management that you want to speak to before we move along.
Sure. Yeah, I don't think I can identify anything that everyone isn't already aware of, but one of the main challenges of privileged access management that we've seen is just identifying your privileged accounts. What constitutes privileged access, defining what that means, and then discovering those that access in the environment and identifying who are the owners. So that whole process of just inventorying and identifying your privileged access is always a challenge. And then another issue that probably many organizations face is integrating your privileged access management system with all of your various platforms. There could be, platforms that don't support or can't integrate with your PAM solution, in which case you'll need to implement the those processes manually, and that tends to be the areas that go wrong, where all of this session monitoring and reviews and so on need to be done manually and outside of that PAM solution.
Thanks, John. And I'm cognizant that we're coming up on the half hour, so I'm just going to run through a couple of high-level challenges that, if anybody has any questions about, please put them in the chat. But other requirements that we expect will pose challenges are centralized security information and event management solution, business continuity and disaster recovery planning and testing, secure backups, backup restoration testing, as well as an annual independent audit of the cybersecurity program. I mean, clearly these new requirements can be daunting to organizations, and wisely, DFS has decided that not all companies are subject to the same requirements. For the next couple of minutes, John, can we discuss what a Class A company is according to these new requirements and what it means to be one under the new amendment?
Sure. So the Class A company is a new concept that's being introduced in the Second Amendment. This is a set of larger organizations which are going to be subject to additional requirements. So the DFS is defining a Class A company as being those with at least 20 million in annual revenue in New York and over 2,000 employees, or a company with at least $1 billion in worldwide revenue that does operations in New York as well. For those Class A companies, there's some additional requirements that apply specifically to them. The annual independent audit of the cybersecurity program is one. They're also required to develop a password policy and then implement automated methods to block any passwords that don't comply with the policy. The privileged access management which we just talked about, is specifically for Class A companies, are required to implement that. Also required to implement endpoint data protection, endpoint detection and response solution, the centralized security incident or information event management solution, and to engage external experts to do risk assessments every 3 years. So, bar being raised for everyone, but especially for the larger organizations.
Thanks, John. And you mentioned bar raisers. Well, before I get to that, I just want to say, as someone who's tested companies' passwords before and password strengths, I feel like this is a really important addition to the policy. Got some great stories about companies that thought they had very strong password policies and come in, test their Active Directory hash and find that there's a lot of weak passwords left over. So it can happen to the best of you. But you mentioned bar raisers, and there are some items that I'm going to mention here that we've considered raising the bar. They apply to all firms covered by DFS, but they're not typically, or may not be, difficult to comply with. They're just new and perhaps trying to push a different kind of mindset in some cases. For instance, the CEO is now required to sign an annual certification of compliance, placing responsibility directly with the CEO. The CISO is going to have an adequate authority and sufficient resources to manage cybersecurity risks. And what that means, we're not entirely clear of, but I'm sure it will be tested as the amendment is rolled out. There are updated in-depth requirements for risk assessments, as we've mentioned a couple of times throughout this webinar. Entities must notify DFS and provide justification if they make a ransomware payment, and this is big. Business continuity, disaster recovery plan development and maintenance, as discussed before, are going to be important and requirements for all entities covered by all firms covered by DFS. And then last but not least, and this again is not a comprehensive list, but some of the things that we've decided are bar raisers. The board of directors are going to have a cybersecurity knowledge and expertise, and are going to be responsible for risk management oversight. Now, clearly, we represent WithSecure, and as such, we're going to take a few minutes to mention services that WithSecure offers that may help these regulated entities meet their requirements. I promise it won't be very long, and then we'll open the floor to questions. John, would you like to cover these
Sales
services
pitch.
that WithSecure offers?
Sure. Of course. So endpoint detection and response, WithSecure offers the Elements solution, which should enable organizations to meet that particular requirement. Requirement for internal and external penetration testing. So this is what we do, and this is what we specialize in. We can do penetration testing on internal web applications, mobile applications. We do external network penetration testing. We do assessments of cloud environments as well. So anything around meeting that requirement, we can help. Risk assessments performed by external experts. So we would consider ourselves expert in that space and can certainly help you meet the requirement for doing those three yearly external risk assessments. The annual independent audit of the cybersecurity program as well. So for organizations that need help with their internal audit or would like additional support there, we can provide that. We could also provide examination support, so doing readiness assessments and helping to do assessments of compliance and getting ready for examinations by New York DFS. We can help you with that. And then lastly, there's a new requirement for incident response plan testing, which Richard is really an expert, does a lot of this work. Maybe Richard, you want to talk about what we do in that space?
Sure. Yeah, thanks, John. So for incident response plan testing, we call that IRR, or incident readiness here. Organizations have different names for it, of course. Some of my favorite or bread and butter parts of that, so to speak, are tabletops, crisis management exercises, where we can work with an organization to understand its defensive and posture and general asset posture. We'll go away and create a fictitious series of incidents that help to test responders at the organization, help to test the documentation, the playbooks, for instance, really help to, in general, kind of work from a something that's very cerebral to allow your people to actually experience it in a non-threatening, although most of the time people take it very seriously, which is great. And frequently people will start to panic a little bit, which is also really great, because if they're panicking in sample exercises, then it helps them kind of tamp that down a little bit, having gone through it when it's not a true threat, when there's a real crisis. So I find these to be incredibly valuable, especially when I've run them for an organization and then rerun them 6 months down the line. You see market improvement across the board typically. So I very much enjoy that. It is kind of part threat modeling, part uplift, and it's a really great time to help security folks understand where their strengths and their weaknesses lay. So at this point, we're going to open the board to questions, but in a mildly self-serving way. I'm going to ask John the first question, and then hopefully folks will add them to the chat. So John, what do you think about the requirement to report ransomware payments?
So that's an interesting one. There was already a requirement to report incidents, which would have included ransomware, but the new amendment is also requiring institutions, covered entities, to justify having made the payment. So ransomware is obviously tough, right? The potential justifications for paying would be that maintaining the availability of critical operations, and especially those that would impact customers or legal obligations. and I think the DFS would understand that, if there's a threat of this, impacting the customers, or you breaking other laws, that you may be forced to consider a ransomware payment. And then the other, and sort of related, is the oftentimes, ransomware will come with a threat to expose sensitive information if the ransom isn't paid. So again, this could be a scenario where you're needing to protect your customers by actually making this payment. Obviously, the disadvantages of paying ransomware is that it encourages more ransomware, right? This provides funding for additional attacks against other organizations, and that also, we all know that we're not dealing with, these are not good guys we're dealing with. So, paying a ransom doesn't guarantee that you're going to get your data back, and it also doesn't guarantee that you're not going to be attacked by the same threat actor in the future. So
And
yeah, I
even,
think this will be interesting how this plays out.
yeah, and frequently we've also been seeing that ransomware attacks that have the time to will sometimes exfiltrate the data that they're able to in an attempt to have a multi-pronged threat to the organization. So, it goes without saying you can't trust ransomware criminals, but you have to be very vigilant, obviously. John, so in your experience, and I think this is a really interesting, I expect you'll have some really great insight into this, but in your experience, what factors most influence penalties from DFS?
So as we mentioned, the penalties have been running in the several $1 million range. We've seen those there was one that was only $150,000 all the way up to $5 million. In the case of that smaller penalty, the DFS specifically mentioned in the consent order that this was based on the size and financial resources of the covered entity, and that sort of extends to probably a smaller customer base. In the updated regulation, one of the interesting things is that the DFS has actually outlined the factors that they'll consider in assessing the penalty. So there's a long list, which you've probably seen if reviewing the draft, but they're talking about, did the covered entity cooperate with our investigations? Are they acting in good faith? Was the incident a result of some unintentional or accident, or was it some more deliberate and reckless that led to the breach? Was it related to a failure to remedy a previous issue that was identified, and then that list continues. So at least this is giving some more kind of transparency into how DFS will go about assessing the penalties under the amended regulation.
Thanks, John. So we've ventured into the Q&A part, obviously. I don't see any questions in the chat. I think we're going to wrap this up in a minute or two, unless anybody wants to drop anything into the chat. Anybody has any further questions for us? In the meantime, was there anything, John, that you would like to kind of recap or closing takeaways, just while we give folks a chance to put something in the QA?
I think I would just say that I don't think that, I would not expect that anyone is being taken by surprise of what's included in the amendment. I expect most organizations are already following these practices, but the challenge is going to be that this is now going to be open for review and examination by DFS. So I'd expect, asset inventory is something new, business continuity plans are something new, with regard to the regulation, but most banks are already doing this. But the challenge is going to be you didn't have DFS putting a microscope on it before. So I think this, again, in preparation would be to review those programs, identify any potential gaps, and look to remediate that going forward. The other, another interesting change is that the DFS in the annual certification of compliance, it just used to be you needed to certify compliance. And in the amended regulation, the covered entities can certify that they're not compliant so long as they provide a remediation plan in a timeline for doing so. So I'd expect that most financial institutions are aware of where they have gaps and have plans in place to close this. The risk management programs are typically good at identifying that. So, thinking in terms of where you have known gaps, you can prepare your plans remediation plans to share with DFS, and that you won't have to, make your CEO sign off on compliance that you're not actually meeting.
Thanks, John. Right, well, thank you everybody for attending. I think that obviously the second comment period is still open, so we don't know what the final scope of this will look like, but we have a pretty good idea, as you can tell from John's deep dive into this. We are paying close attention to the comment period, the comments that come out of it, and what DFS does, changes to the amendment as a result. And we'll be looking forward to speaking to anybody who has any questions for us about it. If you do have questions and would like to reach either of us directly, feel free. There will be some opportunity for follow-up as well through our sales channels, but you're welcome to reach either of us. Our email addresses are our names, first name, period, last name, @widsecure.com. Thank you very much for attending. We both hope that this has been informative, helpful, and that you walk away with a little better understanding of the challenges that this amendment may place on you and your organizations and how to remediate those.